He called me an expensive plumber in a wetsuit. I was the only saturation diver certified to read the acoustic scans, keeping his pipelines legal. I found out about the plumber line before I found out about the firing. That's the order it happened. The insult traveled faster than the paperwork. I was sitting in Chamber 3 at the Deep Gulf Forchon shore base, 12 hours into a decompression cycle after a 6-day saturation dive on the MC-109 pipeline cluster, breathing heliox at 2.4 atmospheres. You don't rush decompression. The gas schedule says, when you surface, not your boss, not the board, not Stanford. The gas schedule. The internal monitor in the chamber had a message queue. Operational updates, weather briefs, dive logs. And at the bottom, time-stamped 3:47 p.m., a termination notice from HR, effective immediately. Reason listed, resistance to modernizing the dive program. I read it twice. I understood it the first time. I wanted to remember the exact phrasing for later. The hatch wouldn't open for another 9 hours. I was locked in a steel tube breathing helium and oxygen at a pressure that would kill a man on the surface, reading my own termination on a 6-inch screen. Bradley Whitmore had fired me from inside a climate-controlled office 40 feet above sea level while I was still pressurized from doing the job he just decided didn't exist anymore. I reached for the comm unit and pressed the button for topside. Miller picked up. Dave Miller, dive supervisor. 22 years in the water between us. Miller, I just got the notice. Silence, then, I know. Ian tried to call the chamber, but they said comms were maintenance only during decom. His voice was flat. Anger that has been burning for hours goes quiet at the edges. He told the board you were the most expensive plumber in a wetsuit he'd ever met. Said it in the executive briefing this morning. Douglas was in the room, didn't say a word. Douglas Whitmore, board chairman, Bradley's father, the man who hired me 11 years ago and now sat in a leather chair while his son called me a plumber. When do you need the locker cleared? I said. Miller paused. That's it? That's what you're asking me? That's what I'm asking you. Monday. They said Monday. Fine. I'll be off gas by 0600 tomorrow. I'll come by Monday. I hung up and leaned back against the chamber wall. The steel was warm from the environmental controls. 60 feet from the Gulf of Mexico, locked in a tube the size of a walk-in closet, and the only thing I felt was the hum of the pressure regulator cycling, the measured, indifferent pulse of a system built to hold. The way things work when they're built right. What happened next is the part that still surprises me. The simplicity of it was the thing. Bradley Whitmore spent $190 million learning how simple it was. Stay with me. Deep Gulf Subsea Services. A $2.1 billion offshore pipeline inspection and repair company operating 23 active pipeline segments in the Gulf of Mexico. Headquarters in Houston, shore base in Forchon, Louisiana, fleet of 4 dive support vessels, and 1 proprietary acoustic imaging system worth $34 million that only 7 people on Earth knew how to interpret. 7. The manufacturer, Meridian Acoustic Systems out of Aberdeen, went bankrupt in 2016. The training program died with the company. The 7 of us who'd been certified were the last class. 2 retired. 1 died in a commercial diving accident off Nigeria in 2019. 1 moved to the North Sea and hadn't worked Gulf contracts in 4 years. 1 was in Perth doing LNG work for the Australians. 1 taught at a university in Bergen and hadn't touched a live array since 2020. That left me. The system read pipeline wall thickness using multi-frequency acoustic pulses at depths where optical cameras are useless. Below 400 feet, particulate density in Gulf water turns a camera into a man staring through milk. You can't see corrosion. You can't see microfractures. You can't see the wall thinning that precedes a rupture, but the acoustic array could hear it. Sound moves through steel differently when the wall is compromised. I could read those returns the way a cardiologist reads an EKG, not because I was smarter than anyone else, because I'd spent 12 years in the Navy learning to listen. Naval Diving and Salvage Training Center, Panama City, Florida. I enlisted at 19, qualified as a deep-sea diver at 21, spent the next 12 years working salvage operations, underwater hull inspections, and classified jobs I still don't discuss. When I separated from the Navy, I spent 4 years doing contract salvage work in the Gulf and the Caribbean, private hull surveys, dock clearance, the kind of work that keeps a diver sharp but doesn't keep him in one place. The acoustic system Meridian built was based on Navy technology from the 1990s. I'd used the military prototype before the commercial version existed. When Deep Gulf bought the Meridian system in 2013, they needed someone who could operate it. They found me through the NDSTC alumni network. Douglas Whitmore flew to Panama City, sat across from me at a diner on Thomas Drive, and offered me the job over shrimp and grits. 11 years. I ran every deep inspection Deep Gulf performed on every pipeline segment under BSEE jurisdiction. BSEE, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, the federal agency that decides whether a pipeline stays active or gets shut down. Their inspection protocol for deepwater segments required acoustic wall thickness data certified by a qualified operator. Not optical, not ROV video. Acoustic data, signed by a name they recognized. My name was on every filing for 11 years. And 23 active segments, each segment re-inspected on a rotating 18-month cycle. The BSEE field office in New Orleans didn't approve the hardware. They approved the certifying signature. They knew my work. They trusted my readings. When a Fletcher Ansley certification landed on a desk at BSEE, it moved to the approved stack without a follow-up call. That relationship took a decade to build. It wasn't a line item on a balance sheet. It was the reason Deep Gulf's pipelines carried 340,000 barrels of oil per day without interruption. Bradley Whitmore wouldn't know that. He'd been CEO for 5 months. Before Bradley, I reported to operations. Clean chain, dive plan, execute, file, repeat. I was underwater more than I was in meetings, which was how I preferred it. The work was hard on everything else. And 11 years of saturation diving means weeks at a time, locked in a pressurized chamber between dives. You eat in the chamber. You sleep in the chamber. You breathe gas mixtures that make your voice sound like a cartoon character and dry your sinuses until they crack and bleed. You do this because the job requires it and because you're the only one who can. My marriage didn't survive it. Carolyn was patient for 6 years. Then she was honest. She told me I'd become a man who lived at the bottom of the ocean and visited the surface. She wasn't wrong. The divorce was clean, no bitterness. She remarried 2 years later. A good man, an electrician in Mandeville who came home every night. I didn't blame her. Ethan was 9 when we split. He's 14 now. He plays soccer for his school in Slidell. Carolyn sends me the schedule every season. Now I've made 4 games in 5 years. 4, out of maybe 60. The text was still pinned to my phone. I'd pinned it there on purpose, the way some men tape things to their dashboard. Carolyn, from 3 months ago. Ethan asked if you're coming to his game. I said probably not. Probably not. She wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate. And accuracy, when it comes from someone who used to love you, cuts cleaner than anything I've felt at depth. The night after I read the termination notice in the chamber, after decompression was complete and I'd surfaced and driven back to my rental in Grand Isle, I sat on the front steps with a glass of ice water and half a lemon squeezed into it. Decompression habit. You hydrate aggressively after a sat dive. Cold water, heavy citrus. Flushes the residual helium faster. Now most guys switch to beer after a few years out of the Navy. I never did. The protocol stuck. The sky over the Gulf was a heavy overcast. No stars. Just the low hum of a supply boat engine somewhere offshore, and the faint chemical smell of the Fourchon processing facility 2 miles east. I sat there for a long time. Didn't check my phone, didn't call anyone, just sat with the glass sweating in my hand and thought about the fact that for the first time in 11 years, nobody needed me to be anywhere, at any pressure, at any depth. I should have felt something sharp. Anger, maybe. Grief. What I felt was the absence of the chamber hum. The environmental system in a sat chamber runs 24 hours a day. It becomes your heartbeat. When it stops, the silence is so total, it feels like a mistake. That's what the steps in Grand Isle felt like. A silence so complete, I kept waiting for something to cycle on. Nothing did. Inside on the kitchen counter, my NDSTC dive knife sat where I always left it between jobs. My first instructor, a senior chief named Ed Garrett, gave it to me the day I qualified. The crest was worn smooth from salt and handling. I picked it up and turned it over once, set it back down. I wasn't being sentimental. I was making sure it was still there. The way you check that the thing that defines you hasn't been reclassified as junk while you were pressurized. Monday morning, I drove to Forchon in the Tacoma, salt-corroded rear bumper. It had looked like that since 2019, and I'd never fixed it, because the truck ran fine and I didn't care what it looked like. I cleared my locker in 12 minutes. Miller was there. He didn't say much. He handed me a cardboard box and watched me pack. He's telling the board he's replacing the dive program with ROV first inspection, Miller said. Optical cameras, says the acoustic system is legacy technology. I zipped my dive bag. Optical doesn't work below 400 feet in Gulf particulate. I told him that. What did he say? Miller's jaw tightened. He said the cameras on the new ROVs shoot in 8K. 8K resolution doesn't help when the water column scatters every photon before it reaches the lens. You could shoot in 16K. You could mount an IMAX camera on the ROV. You'd get a crystal clear image of absolutely nothing. He also said BSEE would accept the ROV data, called it a regulatory formality. I picked up the box, nodded once to Miller, walked out. Bradley Whitmore had a Stanford MBA. He's an Apple Watch Ultra that had never touched water deeper than a swimming pool, and 14 months at an ocean technology startup that built an app for surfers checking wave height. He wore custom-fitted Patagonia vests that still had creases from the packaging. He was Douglas Whitmore's son, and he had just fired the only person in the Western Hemisphere who could keep his company's pipeline certified. BSEE doesn't care about your MBA. BSEE doesn't care about your 8K cameras. BSEE cares about one thing: acoustic wall thickness data, certified by a signature they trust, delivered on a regulatory schedule that doesn't bend for board presentations or earnings calls. 23 active pipeline segments, 18-month inspection cycles. 7 segments were due for recertification within the next 90 days. And the only name BSEE would accept on the filing was sitting in a 2014 Tacoma with a cardboard box on the passenger seat, driving east on Highway 1 toward Grand Isle. Bradley had just emailed the board, promising a 40% reduction in dive program costs and a full transition to ROV first inspection by Q3. He'd used the words Autonomous Pipeline Intelligence Platform in the subject line. 3 days after I cleared my locker, my phone rang. The area code was 713, Houston, but the voice on the other end had a slight Norwegian accent. The man's name was Eric Holstad, managing director of Triton Subsea, the Norwegian-backed deep operations company that had been running pipeline inspection contracts in the North Sea for 15 years and had spent the last 3 building a Gulf of Mexico division out of a leased office park in Friendswood, in Texas. Holstad didn't waste time. Mr. Ansley, I'll be direct. We heard you're no longer with Deep Gulf. We'd like to meet. How'd you hear? Your name disappeared from BSEE's qualified operator registry 2 days ago. My compliance team monitors that list the way most people check the weather. I leaned against the kitchen counter in Grand Isle. The dive knife sat 6 inches from my elbow. When? Tomorrow, if you're available. I'm available. The Triton office was 1 floor of a glass building off Bay Area Boulevard. No marble lobby. No espresso bar. A Norwegian flag on the wall next to a frame bathymetric chart of the troll field. Holstad was tall, thin, early 50s, with a handshake that carried the memory of physical work he'd long since traded for a desk. He had 2 people with him, a woman named Claire Barrett, RVP of Regulatory Affairs, who had a pen behind her ear and a 3-inch binder open before I sat down, and a man named Thomas Reed, Chief Operations Officer, who looked like he'd spent 20 years on dive support vessels because he had. Holstad laid out the offer in 9 minutes flat. Vice President of Deep Operations, salary, equity, and performance structure totaling $8.7 million over 3 years, with a $41 million equity stake tied to division performance. Full authority over the acoustic inspection program, my own team, my own dive schedule, and one condition that made me set my glass of water down. We want you to bid on every BSEE contract Deep Gulf can no longer service, Barrett said. She turned the binder toward me. Starting with the 7 segments due for recertification in the next 90 days. I looked at the binder. She'd already mapped the segments. Pipeline numbers, inspection due dates, operator names, current certification status. Every single one showed the same flag in the certification column. Pending. No qualified operator on file. They'll have to bring in someone else, I said. One of the other 6. Barrett removed the pen from behind her ear. We checked. 2 retired, 1 deceased. One hasn't held a Gulf certification since 2019. Perth and Bergen aren't returning Deep Gulf's calls. We know because we called Perth and Bergen first. She paused. They're returning ours. I signed the Triton offer that afternoon. No negotiation. The numbers were fair and the work was real. I drove back to Grand Isle, sat on the front steps, and drank ice water with lemon while the overcast sky settled low over the Gulf. The supply boat engine was gone. Yet just the water and the chemical smell and the silence. My phone lit up on the step beside me. Deep Gulf Dispatch. I turned it face down. 3 weeks passed. I spent the first one in Triton's Friendswood office building the acoustic inspection protocol for their Gulf division. The Meridian Systems operating manual was 600 pages of specifications that meant nothing without the hands-on interpretation. I wrote the supplementary field guide myself. 41 pages of annotations derived from 11 years of Gulf readings and 12 years of Navy work. Sound propagation tables for Gulf sediment types. Temperature salinity correction curves. The microtonal shifts that distinguish active corrosion from historical scarring. I'd never written it down before. At Deep Gulf, it lived in my head. At Triton, I put it on paper because Holstad asked me to, and because for the first time in years, someone was treating the knowledge like it had value beyond the next inspection cycle. The second week, I dove. Triton had contracted the Meridian equivalent system from a Norwegian manufacturer who'd licensed the original Aberdeen patents before Meridian went bankrupt. Newer housing, same acoustic principles. I calibrated it in 4 hours. Reed watched from topside and didn't say a word until I surfaced. You calibrated that in 4 hours, he said. Could have done it in 3. Your transducer mounting is slightly off axis. I shimmed it. Reed nodded, the nod of a man who'd worked with enough divers to know the difference between competence and performance. The third week, BSEE called. Not Triton's regulatory team, not Barrett's compliance desk. They called me, directly. A field supervisor named Jim Caldwell out of the New Orleans office. I'd worked with Caldwell for 8 years. He'd reviewed every acoustic certification I'd ever filed. Fletcher, I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. Go ahead. Deep Gulf submitted optical ROV data for the MC-109 cluster recertification. No acoustic component. They're claiming the ROV footage constitutes equivalent inspection data under the 2019 Regulatory Guidance Update. I was quiet for a moment. The 2019 update allows supplemental optical data in water depths under 200 feet, where visibility exceeds 15 meters. MC-109 sits at 620 feet. Visibility at that depth in Gulf, particulate averages 1.2 meters on a good day. That's what I thought, Caldwell exhaled. They sent a cover letter, that's signed by someone named Bradley Whitmore, CEO. The letter references an autonomous pipeline intelligence platform and requests expedited review. What did you do with it? Rejected it. Sent a deficiency notice requiring acoustic wall thickness data, certified by a qualified operator. They have 30 days to comply, or we issue a mandatory shutdown order on MC-109. Jim, yeah, MC-109 carries 74,000 barrels a day. I know what it carries, Fletcher. I hung up, sat at my new desk in Friendswood. The NDS-TC dive knife was next to my monitor. I'd brought it from Grand Isle on the first day. Not as decoration, as orientation. A fixed point in a new room. My phone lit up. Deep Gulf Dispatch again. Then a Houston number I didn't recognize. Then Miller. Miller, I answered. It's bad, he said. No greeting. They got the deficiency notice on MC-109. Bradley called an all-hands meeting. He stood up in front of 40 people and said the notice was a bureaucratic formality and that the legal team would handle it in a week. It's not a formality. I know that. You know that. Every diver in the room knew that. He doesn't. He also announced he's submitting the same ROV data package for the next 6 segments coming due. Same format, same cover letter. 6 more. I did the math. Those 6 segments, combined with MC109, carried a combined throughput of 340,000 barrels per day. If BSEE rejected all 7 filings, mandatory shutdown orders would hit every one of them. Fletcher, Miller's voice dropped. He's also telling people you sabotaged the transition. Said you refused to train replacements and deliberately withheld documentation. The phone was warm against my ear. I could hear the shore base behind Miller, the clang of a container crane, a diesel generator cycling. There was no documentation to withhold, I said. The system lived in my head. He never asked for a transfer plan. I told him that, word for word. He said, and I'm quoting, "If one guy's brain is a single point of failure, that's a design flaw, not a personnel issue." A design flaw. 11 years of accumulated expertise in a system that 7 people on Earth understood. 12 years of Navy training before that. 23 pipeline segments. 340,000 barrels a day. And Bradley Whitmore called it a design flaw. There was something to admire in the confidence. Nay, the way you might watch a man stride onto a frozen lake in July, the certainty is remarkable, even if the physics disagree. Dave, I appreciate the call. Keep your head down. What are you going to do? Nothing, nothing, nothing I need to do. If you've spent your career being the person who held something together that nobody else understood, you already know where this is going. If you haven't, stay with me, because the next part is why I'm telling it. I set the phone down and went back to the Triton field guide. Page 23, temperature correction for deep water sediment absorption coefficients. The work was specific and detailed, and mine. Over the next 5 weeks, I watched the way you watch weather moving across the Gulf from a high vantage point. You don't steer it. You don't warn the boats. You watch. La BSEE rejected Deep Gulf submissions on all 7 segments, 7 deficiency notices, 7 30-day compliance windows. Bradley hired an outside ROV contractor from California to reshoot the inspections with higher resolution cameras. They came back with footage that was, by all accounts, technically excellent. Crystal clear images of murky water. High-definition recordings of zero visibility, 412 hours of 8K video, showing exactly what I'd told Miller it would show, particulate scatter, diffused lighting, and not a single readable wall thickness measurement. The 30-day windows closed. One by one, the shutdown orders landed. MC 109 first, then GC 184, then MP 61, then the rest. BSEE doesn't negotiate shutdown orders. The pipelines go cold or the operator faces criminal referral. And Deep Gulf's operations team, good people, most of them, people I'd worked beside for years, shut the valves and watched 340,000 barrels a day stop moving. Bradley called a board meeting. I know this because Miller texted me a screenshot of the calendar invite. The subject line read, "Regulatory Strategy Realignment, Urgent." The meeting was scheduled for 7 a.m. on a Wednesday. Bradley had never scheduled anything before 9. The early hour told me everything the subject line didn't. Meanwhile, I was on a Triton dive support vessel 140 miles south of Fourchon, calibrating acoustic arrays on a BP lateral that had nothing to do with Deep Gulf. The water was 580 feet deep. I was in the chamber, breathing heliox, reading sound. The work was clean. The protocol was mine. The data would carry my signature to BSEE, and Caldwell would approve it without a phone call, the same way he had for 11 years. The only difference was the name on the letterhead. My phone sat in my locker topside. When I surfaced and checked it 2 days later, there were 23 missed calls from Deep Gulf numbers. I scrolled through them the way you read a tide chart, noting the pattern, not the individual waves. The calls started at normal business hours. By day 2, they were coming at 11 p.m., at 1 a.m., at 4:30 in the morning. The frequency told the story. Someone was not sleeping. I set the phone face down on the bench and went to debrief with Reed. That same week, BSEE did something Deep Gulf didn't see coming, and Caldwell's office issued a formal request for proposal to qualified third-party contractors for emergency reinspection of all 23 Deep Gulf pipeline segments. Not just the 7 that had been shut down, all 23. The regulatory language was specific. Acoustic wall thickness survey, certified operator, full compliance filing. Barrett brought the RFP to my desk on a Thursday morning. She set it down next to my dive knife without a word. I read it once, read it again. Triton was one of 3 contractors in the Gulf with acoustic capability. The other 2 didn't have a certified Meridian-class operator. We were the only bidder who could actually perform the work. I looked up at Barrett. She was already looking at me. "When do we submit?" I said. "Already drafted. You just need your signature on the operator qualification page." I signed it with a ballpoint pen, blue ink, same hand that had signed 11 years of Deep Gulf certifications. 3 days later, Triton won the contract, all 23 segments. The fee structure was $2.3 million per segment for the initial survey, plus ongoing monitoring. Total contract value, $52.9 million over 18 months. The first segment BSEE assigned for emergency reinspection was MC-109, the same pipeline cluster I'd been diving on the day Bradley fired me, the same chamber where I'd read my termination notice at 2.4 atmospheres. I was going back to the same water, same depth, same steel, different name on the check. But before I went into the water, something else happened, something that turned a regulatory problem into a federal enforcement action. And it started with what my acoustic readings found on the 11 segments Bradley's ROV program had supposedly cleared as safe. BSEE doesn't just want to know what a pipeline looks like, they want to know what it sounds like. And what MC-109 sounded like, 620 feet below the surface, was a pipe that was quietly falling apart in 11 places no camera on Earth could have seen. I hadn't finished writing the report yet, but Caldwell was waiting for it. Barrett was waiting for it. And somewhere in a Houston office tower, Bradley Whitmore was sitting in a meeting room with a tie pulled loose and sweat stains darkening the collar of a shirt that cost more than my weekly groceries. Now, trying to explain to a room full of board members and federal attorneys why the pipelines his father's company had operated for 2 decades were now under third-party control. I know about the sweat stains because Miller was in the building that day. He sent me one line. "He looks like a different person." I read it, set the phone down, and went back to the data. The report took me 6 days to write. The data was unambiguous. That made precision mandatory. 23 segments surveyed. 11 corrosion anomalies identified on segments that Bradley's ROV program had classified as compliant. 11 points where the pipe wall had thinned past the minimum safety threshold, and no optical camera at any resolution in any water clarity could have detected it. 3 of the 11 were on MC-109 alone, and 1 showed wall reduction to 62% of nominal thickness. At operating pressure, with 340,000 barrels flowing through the system daily, that anomaly was roughly 14 months from a failure event. I wrote it in plain language. Acoustic frequency data, propagation analysis, wall thickness measurements cross-referenced against the manufacturer's original spec sheets. Every anomaly mapped to a GPS coordinate, a pipe section number, and a recommended remediation timeline. 47 pages. No opinion, no editorializing, just what the pipe sounded like and what those sounds meant. I signed the certification page and sent it to Barrett. She forwarded it to Caldwell's office at BSEE New Orleans. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, BSEE had opened a formal enforcement investigation into Deep Gulf subsea services. The agency doesn't move fast on much. But when a third-party acoustic survey reveals 11 undetected corrosion anomalies on active pipeline segments that a company's own inspection program certified as safe, the paperwork finds a different gear. Caldwell's office referred the case to BSEE's Enforcement Division in Washington. The referral cited my report by name, by operator qualification number, by the specific anomaly coordinates I'd logged at 620 feet. The enforcement action landed 6 weeks later. $190 million in civil penalties. $8.3 million per anomaly for the 11 corrosion points. An additional $98.7 million for systemic inspection deficiency across all 23 segments. And a mandatory corrective order requiring Deep Gulf to engage qualified third-party acoustic inspection for every deepwater asset in their portfolio, at their own expense, for the next 5 years. The corrective order named Triton Subsea as the approved contractor, My signature was on every page of the inspection protocol that BSEE attached to the order, the same signature Bradley Whitmore had erased from the company's qualified operator registry 5 months earlier. Deep Gulf stock dropped 52% in the 11 trading days following the enforcement announcement. The $2.1 billion company shed over $1 billion in market capitalization. Pipeline throughput remained at zero on the 7 shutdown segments. Insurance carriers filed coverage disputes, and 3 institutional investors initiated a minority shareholder action, citing gross mismanagement. Bradley called a board meeting for a Saturday. I know this because the board meeting included an outside counsel presentation, and the outside counsel was a firm called Driscoll & Webb, and their lead partner happened to be a man named Alan Driscoll, who had represented Triton on North Sea regulatory matters for a decade. He told Holstad about the meeting. Holstad told me. "They're discussing a leadership change," Holstad said. We were in his Friendswood office. He was standing by the window, looking at the parking lot the way Norwegians look at things, patiently, without expectation. "Douglas Whitmore is on the agenda. Douglas or Bradley? Both." I drank my water, heavy lemon. The ice had melted, but the habit doesn't require cold. Mas, it requires the act. "There's something else?" Holstad said. He turned from the window. "Their subsea division is hemorrhaging. The enforcement order, the shutdown losses, the insurance disputes, they can't operate deepwater assets without acoustic certification, and they can't get acoustic certification without us. The board is exploring a divestiture of the subsea division, and we're going to make an offer." Triton's offer went to Deep Gulf's board the following Tuesday. $127 million for the complete subsea division, vessels, equipment, contracts, shore base, personnel. The division had been valued at $340 million 18 months earlier. Triton offered 37 cents on the dollar. The board had 7 days to respond. They responded in 4. The vote was 6-1 in favor of the sale. And the single dissenting vote was Douglas Whitmore. The chairman voted against selling the division his father had started because his son had destroyed it, and it didn't matter because 6 directors looked at the enforcement order and the stock chart and the shareholder lawsuit and decided that 37 cents was better than 0. Douglas was removed as chairman the same day. The shareholder action had named him specifically, not as the architect of the failure, but as the man who'd installed his son as CEO, without board vetting, without operational review, without a single conversation with the people who actually kept the company's federal certifications active. The filing quoted a line from Bradley's original board email, replacing legacy divers with ROV first inspection. The filing called it the most expensive sentence in Deep Gulf's history. Bradley Whitmore's termination was quieter. No all-hands meeting, no subject line about strategic realignment. Miller told me he cleaned out his office on a Wednesday afternoon. The Apple Watch Ultra was still on his wrist. The Patagonia vest was wrinkled. His hands were shaking when he signed the separation agreement, and he kept touching the side of his neck, the way people do when their pulse is reminding them they're alive and they wish it would stop. Miller said he walked to the elevator without looking at anyone. The doors closed, and that was it. 5 months as CEO. A $190 million enforcement action. $1 billion in shareholder value erased. A company his grandfather built sold off in pieces to a Norwegian firm whose compliance team had seen it coming the day my name disappeared from a federal registry. Last I heard, Bradley was in Austin, not working, not interviewing, living in a condo his father owned. The surfing app startup had folded 2 years before he joined Deep Gulf. He was 29 years old, with a Stanford MBA, and a resume that included the largest BSEE enforcement action in Gulf of Mexico history. Not the kind of line that gets you a second interview. Triton closed the acquisition on a Monday. I flew to Forshon the next morning. Same highway, same salt air, same shore base. But when I walked through the door, the sign above the operations center read, Triton Subsea, Gulf Division. Ma and the office at the end of the hall. The one with the window facing the channel, the one where I used to drop off dive reports and wait for someone to read them, had my name on it. VP of Deep Operations, Gulf Division. The desk was new. The chair was new. The NDSTC dive knife sat next to the monitor, where I had placed it 3 minutes after arriving. I ran the acoustic matrices from that desk. The same frequencies, the same propagation tables, the same sound moving through steel at depth. The work hadn't changed. The name on the certification hadn't changed. The only thing different was that the man doing the work now owned $41 million in equity in the company that paid him to do it. 2 weeks after the acquisition closed, Ethan came to visit. I drove to Slidell on a Saturday morning and picked him up at 6 a.m. He was standing in the driveway with a rod case and a tackle box, 14 years old, taller than I remembered from the last game I'd made. He had Carolyn's jaw and my shoulders, and he didn't say anything when he got in the truck, just set the rod case in the bed and climbed in. We stopped at the Forchon shore base on the way out. I had a set of acoustic returns from the previous day's survey to log before the window closed. Ethan followed me into the operations center, rod case over his shoulder, and stood behind my chair while I pulled up the matrices on the monitor. The NDSTC dive knife sat next to the keyboard where I'd put it on day 1. He looked at the screen. What is that? Sound moving through steel, or 600 feet down. What are you listening for? The part that's going quiet when it shouldn't be. He leaned in closer. I walked him through the frequency return on section 4 of the MC109 lateral, the wall thickness gradient, the corrosion signature, the way a compromise section absorbs differently than sound steel. He didn't understand all of it. He understood enough to stop asking and start watching. That was enough. I filed the data, signed the certification page, and we drove the rest of the way to the Rigolets. I'd bought a 22-foot bay boat with part of the signing bonus, center console, twin outboard, nothing fancy. We launched into the Mississippi Sound. The morning was clear. No overcast, no chemical smell. Just salt air and engine noise, and my son sitting in the bow seat with his feet up on the cooler. And I cut the engine near a grass flat I'd marked on the chart. The silence was immediate. Not the silence of a decompression chamber, pressurized, regulated, sealed. This was open, wind across the water, a pelican working the shallows, Ethan rigging a popping cork without asking for help. My phone was in the center console compartment, off, not face down, not on silent, off, for the first time since Carolyn's text. No BSEE calls, no Deep Gulf dispatch, no 23 missed calls at 4:30 a.m. Just a powered-down screen in a closed compartment on a boat in the Sound, with my son tying a leader knot 10 feet away. He looked over his shoulder. You gonna fish or you gonna sit there? I picked up my rod. Both. He turned back to the water, and the corner of his... He turned back to the water, and the corner of his mouth moved. That was enough. We fished until noon. He caught 3 specks and a redfish that bent the rod double. I caught nothing and didn't care. At some point he asked me if the new job was different. I told him it was the same work, same water, same sound. Then what's different? I thought about it. I am? He nodded like that was a sufficient answer and went back to his cork. On the ride back to the launch, I watched him standing at the bow with one hand on the rail and the wind pressing his shirt flat against his chest. 14. Growing fast. He'd be driving in 2 years, gone in 4. The math on how many Saturdays I had left was simple and unforgiving, and I was done pretending the gas schedule would always come first. There's a thing about acoustic data that most people don't understand. It's not about what you hear. It's about what you hear that nobody else is listening for. A pipe can look perfect to every camera ever built and still be failing at a frequency that only patience and silence can detect. Takes years to learn that. Takes a career. You can't automate it. You can't app it. You can't replace it with resolution. Some men build things that make noise. I built a career out of hearing what the noise was hiding. Turns out, that's the part you can't fire. That's my story. I told you the man called me a plumber. Now you've heard what the plumber knew. If you've ever been the one person who understood the sound nobody else could hear, at your job, in your family, in a room full of people who thought the cameras were enough, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if this one stayed with you, follow along. I'll be here. And there's more to tell.